The fall of Rome, a currency catastrophe. When people think about the fall of Rome, images of barbarians storming the gates, legions collapsing, or emperors poisoned in magnificent marble palaces usually come to mind. Yet empires do not collapse only from external attacks. More often, the real destruction begins from within. And one of the most devastating forces behind this internal decay has always been money. Rome did not fall solely because of invasions or corruption. Its true collapse came with the collapse of its monetary system. And the lessons drawn from this disaster remain relevant today for every modern economy that believes it can manipulate money without consequence. The Roman denarius, the foundation of trust. Let us set the stage. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman economy was the silver denarius. First minted around 201 BC, this coin was almost pure silver and was trusted not only throughout the empire, but far beyond its borders. Roman soldiers were paid with it. Merchants demanded it in trade. Ordinary people stored their savings in it. The denarius was not just a medium of exchange, it was trust cast into metal. The strength of the empire and the value of its currency were directly linked. As long as people believed in Rome, they also believed in its money. The seeds of debasement. Maintaining an empire is always expensive. Legionnaires had to be paid, roads and aqueducts had to be built, and endless wars had to be financed. By the 2nd century AD, Rome found itself fighting on multiple fronts at once, against Germanic tribes in the west, the Parthians in the east, and internal rebellions at home. But tax revenues were no longer sufficient to cover the growing military expenses. At this point, emperors turned to an old and dangerous method, the basement, reducing the amount of precious metal in the coinage. Raising taxes directly would provoke public outrage, so instead, the silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced. How the decline unfolded? The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the early days of the empire, during the reign of Augustus, the denarius contained about 95% silver. By the early 2nd century, under Emperor Caracalla, this ratio had fallen to around 50%. By the middle of the 3rd century, during the reign of Emperor Gallienus, the silver content dropped below even 5%. A coin that had once been nearly pure metal was now nothing more than a bronze disc coated with a thin layer of silver. The consequences: inflation and economic chaos. The people both saw and felt this transformation deeply in their daily lives. Inflation spiraled out of control. Once money no longer rested on real value, prices surged rapidly. Grain that could once be purchased with a single denarius soon cost dozens. This was not a theoretical problem. It turned the lives of ordinary Romans upside down. Soldiers began demanding higher wages to cope with the rising cost of living. Merchants refused to accept rapidly depreciating coins and instead demanded gold or direct barter. Many local economies reverted to barter systems because trust in money had nearly vanished. As trust declined, emperors responded by minting even more cheap coins, believing that quantity could replace value. But this approach only reproduced the same vicious cycle seen in every great inflationary disaster throughout history. The crisis of the 3rd century. This collapse reached its peak during what history now calls the crisis of the 3rd century. Between AD 235 and 284, Rome was shaken for nearly 50 years by invasions, plagues, civil wars, and economic devastation all at once. Emperors rose to the throne at dizzying speed, only to be assassinated within months. Behind all this political chaos lay a shattered financial system. Taxes were collected in money that was constantly losing value. Rather than endure this burden, farmers abandoned their fields. Trade networks unraveled. In desperation, the Roman state imposed price controls and even forced labor in an attempt to survive. None of it worked. Diocletian's failed price controls. One of the emperors who tried to stop the bleeding was Diocletian. In AD 301, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. Thousands of goods and services, from grain to daily wages, had their prices fixed by the state. Those who violated the rules faced the death penalty. But the policy was a complete failure. When money itself is worthless, prices cannot be controlled by decree. Black markets exploded, and official trade nearly collapsed. The people learned a hard truth. No law can restore trust to broken money. The abandonment of the denarius and the solidus. Eventually, Rome was forced to abandon the denarius entirely. Around AD 312, Constantine I introduced a new currency, the gold solidus, pure gold and stable in value. This coin would provide centuries of monetary stability for the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. But for the Western Roman Empire, it was already too late. The debasement of the denarius had hollowed out the economic core from within. Armies were no longer sustainable. Trade networks had disintegrated. Trust had completely vanished. Rome's fall was not a single event. It was a long process of disintegration. And the collapse of its currency was one of the sharpest and most destructive forces driving that process. The lesson from Rome: the death of money. So what does all this mean for us today? It shows that the collapse of a currency is often the collapse of an empire itself. Rome believed it could deceive its people with coins that looked the same on the outside but contained less and less real value inside. Modern governments believe they can do the same by printing paper money, manipulating interest rates, or erasing debts through inflation. But the result is always the same. The people pay the price. Savings evaporate. Trust collapses. Rome learned this lesson at a tremendous cost. If we choose to ignore it, we will learn it the same way. Every great inflationary disaster after Rome has followed the same blueprint. Governments debase money to cover their costs, elites protect themselves with real assets, and ordinary people become poorer. The Roman monetary crisis was the first full-scale example of this pattern in history, the blueprint of collapse itself. Echoes through history. Modern examples. Weimar Germany, 1923. By the 20th century, these echoes returned in terrifyingly familiar form. After World War I, Germany was burdened with crushing war reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. To pay its debts, the government began printing marks, just as Rome once minted ever more coins. By 1923, hyperinflation reached its peak. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war exceeded 200 billion marks by the autumn of that year. People carried their wages in bags, even in wheelbarrows. Pensioners starved to death as a lifetime of savings dissolved into nothing. And just as in Rome, debtors erased their obligations through inflation, while those who owned land, factories, or foreign currency became even wealthier. Money lost all meaning. Economic destruction fueled political radicalization and paved the way for Hitler's rise. Zimbabwe, 2008. Zimbabwe followed a similar path in the early 2000s. Forced land seizures, collapsing production, and rapidly growing debt drove the government to rely on the printing press. By 2008, inflation reached an unimaginable annual rate of 89.76 trillion%. Prices doubled almost daily. Stores could not update price tags fast enough. In the end, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency entirely and adopted the US dollar and South African rand. Once again, a government thought it could deceive reality with money. And once again, ordinary people paid the price. The modern fiat system, the United States. But we don't need to look only at extreme cases. Even in developed economies, the shadow of Rome is visible. Consider the United States. In 1971, President Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. With that decision, the last tangible link between money and real value was severed. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by gold, but by trust in the state itself. As in Rome, spending beyond means suddenly became irresistible. Over the following decades, national debt ballooned, the money supply expanded relentlessly, and inflation became a permanent background noise of the system. We may not have seen wheelbarrows full of cash, but purchasing power has steadily eroded. What $1 could buy in 1971 now requires more than $6 today. The paper is the same. The coins look the same, but their substance has been quietly hollowed out.
Global fragility in the modern world. The method never really changes. Governments present inflation as growth. They sell rising wages as prosperity while hiding the fact that living costs rise faster. They market debt as investment, even though much of it goes into consumption rather than production. They present stock market surges as proof of national wealth, despite the reality that most people own no stocks at all. Just like Roman emperors, they act as if nothing fundamental is changing while silently extracting value from every coin, every banknote, and every paycheck. The true danger today lies in the global scale of this system. Rome's collapse was an imperial crisis. Weimar was national. Zimbabwe was local. But today, the entire world is built on fiat currencies, massive debt burdens, and central banks willing to print trillions in moments of crisis. That means the next collapse will not be confined to a single country. It will spread across the globe. And history already tells us who will pay the price. Not the elites, but wage earners, retirees, and millions who hold their savings in fragile currencies. Lessons for the individual. So what should you, as an individual, take from Rome's monetary collapse? First, inflation is not an accident. It is a policy. For nearly 2,000 years, it has been the silent tax that destroys empires. Second, understand that real wealth does not live on pieces of paper or in numbers on a screen, but in assets that survive when money loses value: land, skills, productive businesses, and tangible resources. Third, never assume stability is permanent. If first-century Romans had been told that their money would one day become worthless, they would have laughed. Germans in 1913 would have dismissed the idea of pushing money in wheelbarrows as absurd. Zimbabweans in the 1980s believed independence would bring prosperity. Yet every time the same story unfolded. Rome's collapse teaches us this clearly. Financial systems decay slowly, then suddenly. When trust evaporates, money dies with it. When money loses its meaning, society itself begins to unravel. Contracts break down, trade collapses, armies dissolve, and the state loses legitimacy. The barbarians at the gates may deliver the final blow, but the true killer is always the treasury. And the essence of the matter is this: history does not repeat itself exactly, but if you fail to understand it, it will still crush you. Rome's monetary crisis was not simply about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about how fragile money becomes when it is abused by those who hold power. And that fragility has never disappeared. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers.